The first time I saw the ocean boil under the midnight sky, I thought I was losing my mind. But here, on the Antarctic research ship Aurora, madness is the least of your worries. We have 11 rules for surviving the long frozen nights, and breaking even one can mean you vanish into the dark, never to be found. I learned that the hard way when someone ignored Rule 3, and I had to watch what came for them. I'm the only night cook aboard, and my shift starts when the world goes silent. Tonight, I think something is already on board. The galley is my kingdom. Stainless steel counters, humming refrigerators, the faint hiss of the coffee machine. It's where I can pretend, just for a few hours, that I'm not trapped on a drifting block of steel, surrounded by an endless black ocean. But on my first night shift, Dr. Kane leaned against the doorway and said those exact words. Never open the galley's porthole after midnight. He didn't smile, didn't explain, just stared at me until I nodded. I thought it was a weird safety precaution, like maybe the latch was faulty or the cold air would mess with the equipment. I was wrong. The first few nights passed without incident. Midnight would come and go, and I'd busy myself with chopping vegetables or baking bread for the morning crew. Sometimes I'd glance at the round, frost-etched window, seeing only my own reflection against the darkness. But the ship has a way of making you curious, especially when you're the only one awake. Around here, every noise echoes, pipes groan, walls creak, and sometimes you hear the faint splash of something hitting the water, though it's not ice. I'd catch myself glancing at the porthole longer than I should, wondering why they needed a rule for something as harmless as opening a window. It was 2 weeks into my shift rotation when the first temptation came. I was slicing onions, half drowsy, when I heard a tapping, soft, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the porthole. I froze, knife hovering midair, listening. The sound was rhythmic, slow, and then it stopped, replaced by what I swear was a muffled voice, low and indistinct, as if someone was whispering through layers of water. My heart thudded, but my curiosity flared. I took one step toward the porthole, then another, my breath fogging in the cold air. My hand touched the latch. That's when I remembered Rule 1, and how Dr. Kane had said it without even blinking. My skin prickled and I stepped back. The next morning, I casually asked one of the engineers if anyone ever worked outside at night, maybe to clear ice or check the hull. He shook his head. No one's out there after midnight, he said. Not if they want to come back. He said it like it was common knowledge, like it didn't need explaining. That only made me think about it more. The tapping didn't return for a few days, but the whispers did. Always faint, always between midnight and 1 in the morning. Sometimes they sounded like my own voice calling from outside. Other times, it was someone else's, familiar, but I couldn't place who. I started brewing extra coffee just to keep myself alert during those hours, because the later it got, the more I felt something waiting for me to slip up. It was a Tuesday night when I made my first real mistake. I didn't open the porthole, not exactly, but I leaned in too close, trying to make out the shapes in the dark water. At first it looked like drifting ice, catching the glow of the ship's lights. Then the ice moved against the current. It floated upward, pale and almost human-shaped, until a face pressed against the other side of the glass. It was smiling, not in a friendly way, but in a stretched, unnatural curve that made my stomach clench. I stumbled back, knocking over a pot. When I looked again, it was gone, but the glass was still wet on the inside. I didn't sleep the next day. The rest of the crew either didn't believe me or pretended not to. Cold makes you see things, said Patel, the ship's medic. Your brain gets bored and fills in the blanks. But boredom doesn't explain the droplets of water I kept finding along the galley floor in the mornings, trailing away from the porthole toward the pantry. I tried wiping them up, but some mornings they were back, before I even started cooking. Once I followed the trail into the pantry and found a single wet footprint on the steel floor, bare, human. facing toward me. Dr. Kane eventually confronted me, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "You've been getting too close," he said. "That's how it starts." When I asked what he meant, he only repeated Rule 1, slower this time, as if drilling it into my skull. "Never open the galley's porthole after midnight. Not even a crack. Not even if you think it's someone you know." His tone made me think about the whispers, the way they sometimes sounded like my voice. I realized he was warning me against more than just curiosity. Something out there wanted me to open it. A week later, the temptation came back stronger. It wasn't tapping this time. It was crying. A woman's sobs, muffled but urgent, coming from the other side of the glass. I gripped the counter, telling myself it wasn't real, but the sound kept going, rising and falling in a way that made my chest ache. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. My reflection in the glass shimmered distorted, and for a moment it wasn't my face looking back. It was hers. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "Just open it." I ran from the galley that night, leaving half-prepped meals behind. The next morning, something new appeared. Scratches on the inside of the porthole, 4 shallow lines, as if someone had dragged fingernails down the glass. I wore gloves after that, not because of the cold, but because I didn't want to accidentally touch the glass again. It didn't help much. Every night the sounds grew stranger. Sometimes it was knocking, sometimes laughter, sometimes the creak of the latch, as if it were moving on its own. I started to wonder if I was the only one hearing it, or if the others were just too scared to admit it. The real breaking point came during a storm. The ship pitched and rolled, wind howling through the corridors. I was trying to keep the coffee from spilling when a violent bang came from the porthole. I turned just in time to see the latch twist, not all the way, but enough that icy spray hissed in. I lunged forward and slammed it shut, locking it with all my weight. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale hand retreat into the black water. My chest heaved, and that's when I understood why Rule 1 existed. It wasn't about the cold, it was about keeping something out. After that night, I never worked in the galley without locking the door from the inside. It didn't stop the noises. If anything, they got bolder. One evening, the whispers turned into full sentences, repeating my name over and over, until I had to blast the radio just to drown them out. When I shut it off, the galley was silent, until a voice right behind me said, "It's warmer out here." I spun around, knife in hand, but the room was empty. The porthole, though, was dripping. I wanted to tell the captain, but Kane caught me in the hallway and shook his head. "You think the captain doesn't know? He made the rules." His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. "Once you see them, they see you. Now they're just waiting." That night, I moved my prep work to the far end of the galley, as far from the porthole as possible. Still, I could feel it, something outside, watching, waiting for the minute I slipped. Then last night happened. I was slicing bread when I heard my mother's voice, clear as day, calling my name from just outside. She's been dead for years. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice pleaded with me, begged me to open the window, just for a second. My hand twitched toward the latch. For one terrifying moment, I actually started to turn it. Then a shadow crossed the glass. Not human, not anything I could name. Long fingers splayed against the inside, pressing so hard the glass bowed inward. I stumbled back, and the latch snapped into place on its own. The voice stopped. I didn't touch the porthole after that, but I don't think it matters anymore. This morning, I found condensation on my bunk, salt water condensation, and in the center of my pillow was a single wet fingerprint. I checked the galley's porthole. The scratches were deeper now. I think whatever's out there knows I almost broke Rule 1, and tonight, I can already hear it tapping. The first time I heard Rule 2, never eat any food you didn't prepare yourself, it felt almost insulting. I'm the night cook. For God's sake. Of course I'd know not to eat someone else's food. But Dr. Kane wasn't smiling when he told me. And he didn't say it like it was about hygiene or kitchen safety. He said it with the same low, deliberate tone he'd used for Rule 1. The kind of tone that makes your skin prickle even before you understand why. If it's not yours, if you didn't make it, you don't touch it. He warned, his eyes flicking toward the galley, like something was listening. I thought maybe he was paranoid about food poisoning. Now I know better. In the early weeks, following Rule 2 was easy. The night shift meant I was usually alone in the galley, making breakfast for the morning crew. If I got hungry, I'd make myself something simple. Eggs, toast, maybe a stew to keep warm in the freezing air. The rest of the crew didn't come in until after sunrise, so the only food around was what I made with my own hands. But about a month in, things started to change. One night, while I was chopping carrots, I noticed a small plate at the end of the counter. On it was a neatly cut sandwich, ham and cheese, crusts removed. The bread was fresh, but I hadn't baked any that day. At first I assumed one of the day crew had left it by mistake. I called out, thinking maybe someone was still nearby, but the galley was empty. The plate was clean, like it had just been washed, and the sandwich looked perfect. Too perfect. The layers were even, the cheese smooth, the ham pink and glossy under the light. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten in hours, and I reached for it without thinking. My hand stopped halfway when I remembered Rule 2. I stared at the sandwich for a long moment, feeling ridiculous for hesitating over something so ordinary. Then I noticed the smell. It wasn't ham. It wasn't cheese. It was salt water. I threw the sandwich out and told myself I was imagining things. But the next night, it happened again. This time it was a steaming bowl of stew, rich and fragrant, placed in the exact same spot on the counter. My name was scrawled on a piece of paper beside it in handwriting I didn't recognize. I leaned over the bowl, and my breath caught, floating just beneath the surface, was something pale, something that looked like a fingertip. I slammed the lid on and shoved it into the trash. When I looked back at the counter, the note was gone. I started locking the galley door after that, but it didn't help. Some nights, the food would just appear. A slice of pie, a mug of cocoa, once a plate of spaghetti so fresh I could see the steam curling upward. Each time the smell was wrong. Too briny, too cold, or worse, faintly metallic. And each time, I'd feel this gnawing hunger, like my own body was urging me to eat it, like whatever it was knew exactly what I was craving in that moment. One evening, Patel wandered in early and saw me dumping a plate of cookies into the trash. "Why are you wasting those?" he asked, grabbing one before I could stop him. I shouted at him to put it down, but he just laughed and took a bite. The sound he made after, it wasn't laughter anymore. He dropped the cookie, clutching his mouth, and spat something into his hand. It wasn't crumbs, it was a tooth. His own. Blood pooled on the floor as he staggered out without another word. The next morning, Patel was gone. The crew said he'd been transferred to another vessel for medical reasons. I didn't believe it. From then on, I was even more careful. I made all my meals from scratch, and I kept a close eye on the counters. But the thing about hunger is, it messes with your mind. There were nights I almost caved, when the smell of roasted chicken or fresh bread was so vivid, I could taste it. Once I swore I heard a voice whisper from behind me, soft and coaxing, "It's safe. I made it for you." When I turned, the galley was empty, except for a single apple on the counter. It was the reddest apple I'd ever seen, its skin flawless, shining under the light. My hand reached out before I could stop it, and my fingers brushed the skin. Cold, too cold. I dropped it instantly. I tried telling the captain about the food, but his expression didn't change. He just repeated Rule 2 and told me to stay hungry if I had to. That didn't sit right with me. Why would he rather I starve than risk eating something I didn't make? Unless it wasn't really food at all. I started thinking about the porthole from Rule 1, about the whispers calling my name. What if the same thing that wanted me to open that window had found another way in? 2 weeks ago, I woke up in my cabin to find a tray on my desk. On it was a full breakfast, pancakes, eggs, bacon, the works. I hadn't left my door unlocked, and the crew swore they hadn't been in my room. I didn't eat it, of course, but the smell lingered all day, clinging to my clothes, my hair. That night, I dreamt I was eating in the galley. The pancakes were soft and sweet, the bacon perfectly crisp. When I woke, my lips were sticky with syrup. Except, it wasn't syrup, it was blood. Things have escalated since then. The food no longer appears only in the galley. I found it in my locker, on my bunk, even sitting on the steps outside my cabin. Always fresh, always perfect, and always something I've been craving at the exact moment I see it. I've stopped trusting my hunger. I eat only when I'm working, and even then, I double-check every ingredient, every container. Once I bit into a piece of bread I'd just baked, only to find it wet inside, like it had been soaked in seawater. I spat it out and nearly gagged on the smell. Last night, the thing, whatever it is, got bold. I was slicing vegetables when I felt breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, knife raised, but the galley was empty. On the counter, where there had been nothing a moment before, was a steaming bowl of soup. My mother's recipe, exactly how she used to make it. I could even smell the rosemary she always added at the end. I don't know how it knew. My hands shook as I carried the bowl to the trash, but just before I tipped it in, I saw something move beneath the surface. A small pale hand, no bigger than a child's, curling into a fist. I dropped the bowl, and the soup splashed across the floor. The hand was gone. Tonight, I'm not going to the galley at all. I'll stay in my cabin, lock the door, and wait for daylight. But even as I write this, there's a knock outside. A soft, polite knock. I can smell fresh bread baking, even though I know no one's cooking. The knock comes again, slower this time, and a voice says, "I made it just for you." My stomach growls so loudly it hurts. I'm not hungry. I tell myself I'm not hungry. But I can feel the latch on my door trembling, like it's about to turn on its own. The lower deck is where the ship's heartbeat lives. The endless rumble of engines, the clank of machinery, the low hum that seeps into your bones if you stand there long enough. I didn't spend much time there in the beginning. As the night cook, my place was in the galley. But sometimes, especially when supplies ran low, I'd have to make the walk down to the storage rooms at the far end. On my second week, the captain himself stopped me before I went below and said, almost casually, "Rule 3. If you hear footsteps behind you in the lower deck, do not turn around." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The way he gripped my shoulder told me enough. The first few trips down there were uneventful. The lower deck corridors are narrow and dim, lined with pipes that hiss and drip with condensation. My footsteps echoed so loudly on the steel floor that I could barely hear anything else. Still, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder from time to time, just to make sure I was alone. The sound down there plays tricks on you. A distant clank can sound like it's right behind you, and your own footsteps sometimes bounce back in odd rhythms. I told myself that's all the rule was about: paranoia and bad acoustics. That illusion shattered one night when I went down for a crate of canned goods. The air was colder than usual, the kind of cold that makes you feel like you've stepped outside without a coat. Halfway to the storage room, I heard it. Soft, slow footsteps, not matching my pace. They were lighter than mine, almost hesitant, and they came from just a few feet behind me. I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to see who was there. But the words of Rule 3 hit me like a slap. I forced myself to keep walking, each step heavier than the last. The footsteps followed. At first, they kept their distance, but as I got closer to the storage room, they quickened, closing the gap. I could feel something behind me now, not just hear it, but feel it, like the air around my neck was denser, colder. My hands were shaking as I gripped the storage room door, fumbling with the latch. The moment I stepped inside, the footsteps stopped. I slammed the door shut and stayed there for several minutes, pretending to check the shelves while my heart tried to calm down. When I finally stepped back into the corridor, it was empty. The next morning, I mentioned it to Kane. He didn't laugh or dismiss me like he sometimes did. He just asked, "Did you turn around?" When I told him no, he nodded. "Good. If you had, we wouldn't be talking right now." That should have been enough to scare me off from ever going back down there, but the lower deck has a way of calling you when you need it most. Supplies don't restock themselves, and someone always has to make the trip. A week later, I wasn't so lucky. It was a supply run again, but this time, the lights down there were dimmer than usual, flickering in and out. I moved quickly, not wanting to linger, when the footsteps started up again. This time, they were heavier, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. I gripped my crate tighter, walking faster, telling myself over and over not to look. But then I heard it, my name whispered in a voice I recognized. It was Patel, the man who'd vanished after breaking Rule 2. "Usman," he said, "turn around. I need your help." Every muscle in my body tightened. My hands ached from gripping the crate, and my feet felt rooted to the floor. I wanted to believe it was really him, that maybe he'd been hiding somewhere on board, but the sound of his footsteps wasn't right. They were too slow, too drawn out, like someone was dragging one foot behind the other. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, and forced myself to keep walking. The voice didn't stop calling my name until I stepped back into the stairwell, where the hum of the engines gave way to the safer, warmer air of the upper decks. After that, the footsteps became a regular occurrence. Not every time I went down, but often enough that I started timing my visits for when the day crew was awake, even if it meant crossing paths in the cramped halls. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if other people are around. The footsteps are always meant for you alone. More than once, I've passed crew members on the lower deck and asked if they'd heard them, only to get blank stares in return. "No one was behind you," they'd say. 2 nights ago, it got worse. I'd gone down to retrieve a bag of flour for the next morning's bread. Halfway there, the footsteps started, light, quick, keeping perfect time with mine. I forced myself to walk at a steady pace, but then the air grew warmer instead of colder. The smell of salt water flooded my nose, mixed with something sweet, like overripe fruit. The footsteps stopped. I thought it was over, until something exhaled right behind my ear. The breath was warm, wet, and far too long. My knees nearly gave out, but I kept moving until I reached the storage room, slamming the door shut with my back pressed against it. That's when I heard it, something scratching on the other side. Not claws, fingernails, slow, deliberate, tracing patterns on the metal. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but condensation covered the floor in long bare footprints, leading away from where I'd been standing. This morning, the captain pulled me aside. "Don't go down there tonight," he said, like it was just a suggestion. But I could tell from his face it wasn't. He looked worried, not for the ship, not for the supplies, for me. Which makes me think, whatever's down there has taken an interest in me specifically. I wish I could promise I won't go, but the day crew just informed me we're out of coffee beans. And without coffee, the mornings turn ugly fast. Now it's almost midnight, and I'm standing at the top of the stairwell, listening to the ship's deep hum rising from below. I know the footsteps will come. I know I can't turn around, but part of me wants to. Part of me needs to know what's been following me all this time. The ocean around Antarctica is darker than anything you've ever seen, a vast, endless void that swallows light whole. On clear nights, you can see the stars reflected in the water, like a shattered mirror scattered across black glass. But the nights aren't often clear here, and even when they are, no one stands at the rail for long. Too much staring into that darkness, and you start to see shapes. Still, I'd never been afraid of the water until the captain told me Rule 4. If you see a light on the water after 2 a.m., do not signal back. At first I thought it was just about safety. Maybe ships out here don't like being flagged down by strangers, or maybe it was about avoiding icebergs. But there's no mistaking the intent in the captain's voice when he gave me the warning. This wasn't about accidents. It was about something else. He even told me to keep the galley blind shut after hours, so nothing outside could see the lights inside. I laughed it off, but he didn't laugh with me. The first time I saw the light, I'd just finished scrubbing the last of the dishes. It was almost 2:30, and the galley felt too warm, so I stepped outside for some air. The cold hit me like a punch, the kind that makes your eyes water instantly. I leaned on the railing, my breath turning to fog in front of me, when I noticed it. A single white light bobbing gently on the horizon. It was too far to make out clearly, but it had a steady rhythm, like the blink of a distant lighthouse. For a second, I considered waving my flashlight toward it. Then Rule 4 slammed into my mind, and I froze. The light drifted closer. It wasn't fast, more like it was being carried by the current. The strange thing was, the water was calm, almost unnaturally so, and there was no sound but the low hum of the ship's engines. I stayed still, my hand gripping the rail so tightly my knuckles hurt. The light continued to approach, until I could make out the faint outline of something below it. Not a boat, not anything that should have been there. It was too wide, too low in the water, and it didn't move like anything I recognized. Then, as if it knew I was watching, the light blinked twice in quick succession. That was when I stepped back from the rail. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. I didn't turn away from it until I was back inside with the blinds drawn tight. I told myself it could have been anything, a drifting buoy, maybe, or some kind of research equipment. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The second time was worse. It was a week later, and I wasn't even on deck. I was in my bunk, trying to get some rest before my shift. I woke up to a faint glow slipping through the thin curtain over my porthole. My first thought was sunrise, but it was far too early for that. The glow pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. I slid out of bed and moved closer, careful not to draw the curtain all the way. Through the small gap, I saw it again, the same white light, floating just beyond the ship's hull. This time, it was so close I could see the ripples it made in the water. And it wasn't alone. Two smaller lights hovered just beneath the surface, faint but steady, like eyes watching from the deep. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped, my mind racing. Whatever it was, it had found me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and by morning, the lights were gone. I tried telling Kane about it, but he just shook his head. If you see it again, don't even look directly at it. And for God's sake, don't signal back. His voice was low, but I could tell he was serious. I wanted to ask what would happen if I did, but part of me didn't want the answer. Last night, I almost broke the rule. I was on deck again, checking the ropes after a sudden wind had kicked up. The air was freezing, but I could feel sweat on the back of my neck. That's when I noticed a faint flicker in the distance. This time, it wasn't white. It was a deep, pulsing red. My flashlight was in my pocket, and my hand twitched toward it before I stopped myself. The red light swayed side to side, as if beckoning. And then, I heard it, a voice. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. It was my mother's voice. She was calling my name, just loud enough to carry over the water. I knew it wasn't possible. She's thousands of miles away, and she doesn't even know exactly where I am. But hearing her made my chest ache, made my fingers curl tighter around the flashlight. For a moment, I thought, what's the harm in signaling back just once? But something in me, some deep primal instinct, screamed no. I stepped back, gripping the rail, until the light faded. Now I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd given in. This morning, there was a patch of frost on the deck, where I'd been standing last night. It wasn't anywhere else, just that one spot, a thin, perfect circle of ice. The captain saw it too, and the look on his face told me I wasn't imagining it. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. It's 1:55 a.m. now, and I'm writing this in the galley with the blinds shut tight. The wind has died down, and the air feels heavy, like the moments before a storm. Part of me wants to peek out, just to see if it's there again. I know I shouldn't. I know what Rule 4 says, but the problem is, I think it already knows I'm watching for it. Midnight is different on the Aurora. During the day, even with the cold, there's movement, crew shifting equipment, the hum of conversation, the occasional laughter. But after midnight, it's as if the ship itself is holding its breath. The lights in the corridors dim to a dull yellow, the engines drop to a low, steady hum, and every sound seems amplified. It's at this time that Rule 5, never eat alone after midnight, even if you think you're the only one awake, feels less like superstition and more like a lifeline. The captain told me about it on my first night shift, after I'd asked why the crew seemed to always eat in pairs or groups. It's not about company, he said, leaning close so no one else could hear. It's about being seen. You don't want to be seen eating alone. His words stuck with me, though at the time I assumed he was talking about polar bears or some other wildlife. Out here you make up stories to explain away fear, but I was about to learn that some rules exist because someone saw what happens when you ignore them. The first time I was tempted to break it was pure laziness. It was late, about 12:30, and I'd been busy cleaning up after a long day. Most of the crew had gone to bed, and I was starving. The galley was empty, quiet except for the low rattle of the heater. I grabbed a bowl of leftover stew and sat down at the nearest table. The first bite was still warm when I felt it, a prickle at the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced toward the doorway, expecting to see Kane or one of the other night crew. The hallway beyond was empty. I shrugged it off, but as I went for the second bite, something flickered in my peripheral vision. A shadow, thin, elongated, slid across the far wall. My heart stuttered, and I set the spoon down, listening. The hum of the ship was steady, the heater still rattling, but there was another sound. A faint, wet clicking, like someone chewing slowly. I told myself it was just the pipes. I was halfway through convincing myself when I saw it. A figure stood just inside the doorway. At least I thought it was a figure. It was hard to tell. The edges seemed to blur, like it was moving too slightly, too constantly to focus on. The only clear thing about it was its face, pale and long, with eyes so dark they seemed to sink into its skull. Its mouth hung slightly open, and even from across the room, I could hear the sound again, that slow, deliberate chewing. I froze, my hand halfway to the bowl. The thing tilted its head, like it was listening to my breath. Then it stepped forward, one foot gliding noiselessly across the floor, its movements almost liquid. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted from my seat, leaving the stew untouched, and ran straight to Kane's quarters. When I told him what I saw, he didn't ask for details. He just muttered, "You were eating alone, weren't you?" and shook his head. From that night on, I made sure someone was always with me when I ate after midnight, but not everyone took it seriously. 2 weeks later, a junior mechanic named Ellis decided he didn't need to follow Rule 5. He was young, cocky, and fond of saying, "If there's something on this ship, I'll feed it before it feeds on me." One night, I came into the galley around 12:15 and found him sitting by himself with a sandwich, grinning like he'd just won a bet. "See, nothing happens," he said, mouth half full. I didn't sit down. I didn't even answer. I just turned and left, because the moment I stepped inside, I'd felt it again. That wrongness in the air, like a shift in pressure before a storm. I went back to my quarters and locked the door. The next morning, Ellis was gone. His sandwich was still on the table, but the bread was soaked through with something dark, almost black, that smelled like seawater and rust. No one said his name at breakfast. No one had to. Since then I've made sure to plan my meals carefully. But last night, Things didn't go as planned. The other night cook had gone to bed early, and the deckhands were running late on repairs. I waited until 12:05, hoping someone would join me, but the hunger gnawed at me until I finally gave in. I reheated some fish and sat at the far end of the galley, telling myself I'd eat quickly and get out. The first 3 bites went fine, then the heater shut off. Not all at once, like someone flipping a switch. It wound down slowly, the rattle fading to silence. I looked toward the doorway, empty. I glanced at the porthole, and that's when I saw it. Something pressed against the glass. It was a hand, too long, too thin, the fingers tapering into sharp bony points. The skin was the same pale grayish-white I'd seen before, stretched tight over the bones. Slowly, the fingers curled, tapping against the glass in time with my heartbeat. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then from behind me, I heard it, the chewing. Slow, wet, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I left the food on the table and walked straight out, never once looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop until I was in my quarters with the lights on, and even then, I thought I could still hear the tapping on the glass. Tonight, I won't risk it, but I keep wondering, if I hadn't left the food behind, would it have followed me instead? The Antarctic winds can make you hear things. On most ships, you learn to ignore them. The howling, the creaks, the distant moans that sound like voices in the dark. But here, on the Aurora, the voices sometimes know your name, and that's when Rule 6. If you hear your name whispered from the empty deck, do not answer. It is not a crew member, becomes more than just a line on a list. It becomes a fight for your sanity. It started for me during my 3rd month aboard. Nights had become routine. Cook, clean, prep for breakfast. Try not to think about the things I'd already seen. The deck was my one place to breathe when the galley walls felt too close. And sometimes I'd stand out there for a few minutes, letting the cold sting my face. That night was calm, the sea like black glass, the sky heavy with stars. I was alone, or so I thought, when I heard it. Daniel. It was soft, almost affectionate, like someone saying it just behind my shoulder. I spun around. The deck was empty. The nearest crew quarters 2 levels below. My breath fogged the air as I scanned the shadows. No movement, no sound but the hum of the engines. I told myself it was the wind, but the way it shaped my name felt deliberate, too perfect. The next night, it happened again. This time, I stayed still, telling myself I wouldn't give it the satisfaction of a reaction. The whisper came again, Daniel, but it was closer now, as if whoever spoke had taken a step toward me. My instinct screamed to answer, to call out and demand who it was, but the captain's voice in my memory stopped me cold. Don't speak to it. Don't even think about speaking to it. Not everyone listened. Kane, the same guy who once told me about Rule 1, had warned me that a deckhand named Harper had vanished 2 winters ago because he didn't take Rule 6 seriously. He'd been working alone on night watch when he heard someone calling him from the bow. The story went that he answered without hesitation, called back, "Be right there," and then just didn't come back. They found his gloves near the railing, stiff with ice. No footprints leading away. No splash to suggest he'd fallen. Just gone. I wanted to believe it was just another ghost story to keep us in line. Until last week, it was 1:40 in the morning, and I was headed from the galley to the supply storage when I passed the main stairwell to the deck. That's when I heard it, my name, faint but clear, drifting down the stairs. I froze halfway up. Daniel. It was different this time. Slower, almost drawn out, like someone savoring the syllables. I gripped the railing so hard, my knuckles ached, staring at the patch of moonlight spilling across the landing. Then came a second voice. Daniel, come up here. I recognized it immediately. It was Ellis. My stomach turned ice cold. Ellis had been gone for weeks. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I turned around and went the long way to the supply room. avoiding the deck entirely, but I couldn't shake the sound of his voice. The same pitch, the same rhythm. If it was just the wind, then the wind had learned how to mimic the dead. The worst part came last night. I was back on the deck for the first time in days, standing near the stern. The ocean was restless, the waves slapping against the hull. I was about to go back inside when I heard it again. Daniel. This time it was right in my ear. Warm breath brushed my skin, but when I turned, no one was there. The deck was empty from bow to stern, the only movement the sway of the ship. And then I felt it, fingers, ice cold and thin as bone, just barely grazing the back of my neck. I didn't even look. I bolted inside, locking the hatch behind me. My pulse was still racing hours later when I finally collapsed in my bunk. But as I lay there, trying to convince myself I was safe, I heard it again, muffled, coming from outside my cabin door. Daniel, open up. I didn't take Rule 7. Never eat food left unattended in the galley overnight. It will not be what you think it is seriously at first. I mean, I'm the night cook aboard the Aurora, the Antarctic research vessel that creaks like an old ghost with every swell. I know every inch of the galley, every dent in the countertops, every squeaky hinge on the cabinets. I control what comes in, what's cooked, and what's stored. The idea that something could appear in my kitchen without me knowing was laughable. That is, until the first night I saw the biscuits. It had been a calm shift, as calm as the Southern Ocean gets. The scientists were asleep, the deck crew too tired to wander in for midnight snacks. I'd baked a tray of buttermilk biscuits earlier, their golden tops gleaming under the galley lights. I left them cooling on the counter while I stepped into the freezer to grab supplies for the morning. I was gone, maybe 4 minutes. When I came back, the biscuits looked exactly the same. Same arrangement, same inviting smell. But when I tore one in half, a black, slick mass slid out, glistening like oil. It wasn't a spill or filling. It was alive, contracting and expanding faintly, as if breathing. I dropped it instantly, but the thing oozed toward the drain in slow, purposeful ripples. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. I'd been up for 18 hours straight, after all, but the next night, I found something worse. A pot of beef stew I'd left on low heat now had a strange sheen on top, like gasoline on water. The vegetables had softened into a pale mush, the meat strands twisting into something like fibers, and floating near the top were dozens of translucent shapes that looked disturbingly like human fingernails. I dumped the whole pot into the disposal chute, the smell lingering in my nostrils long after the galley was clean. Kane, the old engineer, noticed me bleaching the counters later that morning. "Stew go bad?" he asked. His voice was casual, but his eyes lingered on the sink too long. When I told him what I'd seen, he didn't look surprised. "Happens sometimes," he said. "That's why we have Rule 7. The galley's not ours after midnight. Sometimes something else uses it. If you find food that wasn't yours, you leave it. If you leave your own food unattended, it isn't yours anymore." He told me about Lot, a deckhand from 5 winters back. Lot had come off a grueling shift, found a sandwich sitting on the prep table at 3 a.m., and ate it without asking. The next morning, they found him dead in his bunk, mouth stuffed full of what looked like strands of green kelp. No crumbs, no plate, no sign of the sandwich anywhere. After hearing that, I swore I'd follow Rule 7 to the letter. For a while I did. I'd never leave anything out, and never touch anything I didn't make. I locked up the bread, wrapped every dish, even kept the cooler latched. But last week, during the worst storm we'd had all season, I slipped. It was just after midnight. The wind howled like something alive, rattling the metal walls. The lights flickered twice, once dimming so low I could barely see the floor. I'd been working for hours and hadn't eaten since lunch. My stomach cramped, my hands shook from hunger. That's when I saw it, a steaming bowl of clam chowder on the prep table, spoon already in place. It wasn't there 5 minutes ago. Nobody else was awake. I froze, my eyes darting to the corners of the galley. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing on my chest. I knew it was a trap. I told myself over and over, don't touch it, don't even get close. But the smell hit me. Rich cream, butter, smoked bacon, the tang of fresh clams. My mouth watered so hard it hurt. Before I could stop myself, I sat down and took a spoonful. The texture was wrong immediately. Not smooth and hearty like chowder, but grainy and moving. Tiny sharp fragments scratched my tongue, wriggling like they had somewhere to go. The taste shifted in seconds from buttery seafood to the copper tang of blood. I spat it out, the spoon clattering against the bowl. The liquid in the bowl shivered like it had heard me, then slowly began to recede into itself, thickening until it was almost solid. I gagged, trying to wash the taste from my mouth, but even after rinsing with hot water, I could feel something clinging to my teeth. The sensation lasted hours. By dawn, it had faded to nothing but a faint burning in my throat. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to be the next lot. 2 days later, something worse happened. I was chopping onions when I heard a faint tapping sound, not from the door, but from the countertop right next to me. I looked down. A slice of bread, perfectly buttered, lay there. I hadn't made it. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The bread twitched, just slightly, but enough for me to know it was alive. Then slowly a second slice appeared beside it, sliding into place without a hand to guide it. The tapping continued, like a knife hitting a cutting board in another dimension. I left the galley without turning back. Since then, the appearances have become more frequent. Sometimes it's a plate of eggs. Sometimes it's a whole roast chicken, skin glistening like lacquer, always perfect, always waiting, and always at night. The others have noticed too. They avoid the galley after dark, unless they absolutely have to. Even the captain won't step inside without me. Last night, I woke up with a weight on my chest. I opened my eyes to find a half-eaten biscuit sitting on my shirt, crumbs spread across my skin. The bite mark in it was mine. I hadn't eaten it. The freezer on the Aurora is the size of a small bedroom, lined with shelves that bow under the weight of frozen meat, crates of vegetables, and blocks of ice-hard bread. It hums constantly, the deep vibration working its way into your bones when you stand inside too long. I've worked in a lot of kitchens, but nothing about this one felt wrong. Not until I learned about Rule 8. If you hear knocking from inside the freezer, do not open it under any circumstances. Kane told me about it over coffee my second week on board, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear. If you hear it, he said, you leave it. Doesn't matter if it's 1 knock or 100. At first I thought it was just another crew superstition, the kind of story you tell the rookie to keep them on edge. But that changed during the 3rd month of our voyage, when the sea locked up in pack ice and the Aurora groaned like something trapped under the weight. It was a night shift, the air so cold that my breath formed clouds inside the galley. I'd stepped into the freezer to grab some frozen cod, the light flickering just once before steadying again. That's when I heard it, 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the farthest wall. I froze, the cod forgotten in my hands. The sound wasn't like metal creaking or boxes shifting. It was deliberate, knock, then silence. I told myself it was ice expanding against the hull. It had to be. But the wall it came from didn't face the ocean. It faced the storage hold, a space that, as far as I knew, was empty. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on that wall until the door swung shut behind me. 2 nights later, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, hard enough to rattle the shelving. I stood outside the freezer door, my hand on the latch. My first instinct was to check, to make sure no one was trapped inside. But the memory of Kane's warning stopped me cold. I stayed where I was, listening. The knocks changed rhythm, almost like a signal. 4 quick taps, A pause, then two slow thuds, then faintly, something that sounded like breathing. I told Kane about it in the morning. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, just stared at me for a long time. "Did you open it?" he asked. When I said no, his shoulders relaxed. "Good, don't ever." Lot opened it once. Just once. We found the door wide open and frost covering the walls, but Lot wasn't inside. The only thing we did find was a trail of wet footprints leading down to the bilge, bare feet. That should have been enough to keep me away, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. The next time the knocking came, I decided to test something. I left the freezer door closed, but I spoke through it. "Who's in there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The knocking stopped, then came a slow scrape, like nails dragging across metal, moving closer. I backed away so fast, I nearly tripped over a crate. After that night, the knocking didn't happen for over a week. I thought maybe whatever it was had given up, but then during another storm, it came back, different this time. Instead of knocks, there was a single steady pounding, like someone trying to break the door down. I could feel the vibrations through the floor. My heart raced, my hand twitching toward the latch. Before I remembered Rule 8, I stepped back and counted the seconds until it stopped. It didn't. It went on for over an hour. The worst part, when I checked the freezer in the morning, everything was exactly where it should be, but frost patterns had formed on the inside of the door, patterns that looked like handprints. Too many handprints to count. Last night, something new happened. I was alone in the galley, chopping onions, when the freezer light clicked on by itself. I could see it glowing under the door, flickering faintly. Then came the knocking, but it wasn't from inside the freezer anymore. It was from the other side of the galley wall, the one that led to the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like whatever had been inside was now outside, just waiting for me to make the wrong move. I haven't opened the freezer since, but I think the thing inside knows my name now. My cabin on the Aurora is barely bigger than a storage closet. A narrow bed, a metal desk bolted to the wall, and a porthole that's been iced over for months. It's not much, but it's private, and privacy is a rare commodity out here. Still, I never really worried about keeping food in my room, until Kane pulled me aside one evening, his tone flat and serious. "Rule 9. Never eat any food left in your cabin after midnight," he said. "Even if it's something you swear you brought yourself. Especially then." At first it seemed ridiculous. We were hundreds of miles from the nearest port. No one was sneaking snacks into my room, but the first time it happened, I understood. It was during a long stretch of night shifts, when I'd been running on too little sleep and too much coffee. I woke at 2:13 a.m. to the faintest smell of warm bread. My stomach growled before my brain could even catch up. The scent was so vivid, it felt like someone had just pulled a loaf from the oven and set it on my desk. When I sat up, I saw it, a plate with a thick slice of bread, steam curling off it, sitting exactly in the center of my desk. The thing was, I hadn't brought bread to my cabin in days. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe one of the crew had left it as a joke. Maybe I'd been too tired to remember bringing it in. My hunger drowned out my hesitation. I reached for it. That's when I saw the crumbs. They weren't scattered on the plate. They were lined up in a perfect circle around it, almost like a boundary. My hand hovered in the air, and in that moment, Kane's warning rang in my head. I pushed the plate away, my stomach twisting in protest. The bread cooled quickly, the steam fading, and when I glanced back a minute later, it was gone, plate and all. The next morning, I told Kane. He just nodded. "If you'd eaten it, you wouldn't be talking to me right now." I asked what would have happened, but he only said, "Some hungers out here don't belong to you." That was enough to keep me cautious, at least for a while. Weeks passed without incident. Then one night, after a brutal shift, I came back to my cabin to find a steaming bowl of stew on my desk. The smell was intoxicating. Rich broth, tender meat, herbs I couldn't place. My hands shook as I picked it up. Not from hunger this time, but from fear. I set it in the hallway, shut the door, and forced myself to lie down. That's when I heard it. The sound of someone slurping from just outside my door. Slow, deliberate. The spoon clinking against the bowl. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When the sound stopped, I counted to 100 before opening the door. The hallway was empty, but the bowl was gone. The only thing left was a faint smear of something dark and oily on the floor, leading toward the stern of the ship. By the third time, I'd developed a routine. Don't touch it, don't smell it too long, and for God's sake, don't taste it. But the thing leaving the food was getting bolder. Once I found a full tray of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables sitting on my bed. The mattress still indented like someone had been sitting there. Another time, it was a single apple, placed on my pillow. That apple stayed there for 3 days without rotting, before disappearing entirely, while I was in the galley. 2 nights ago, I made the mistake of falling asleep at my desk. I woke to find my hand already holding a fork, halfway to my mouth, and in front of me was a slice of pie I'd never seen before. My teeth were less than an inch from it, before I snapped back, flinging the fork across the room. The pie vanished, the second it left my sight, leaving nothing but the metallic taste of fear on my tongue. I don't know what's bringing the food, or why it wants me to eat it so badly, but I do know that last night, for the first time, I woke to the smell of fresh bread again. Only this time, it wasn't on my desk, it was on the floor, right next to my bed. Working as the night cook on the Aurora means the freezer is my domain. It's a massive walk-in unit, a steel room colder than the deck during a whiteout, lined with shelves of frozen meat, fish, vegetables, and vacuum-sealed meals. I keep it organized because chaos in there can cost precious minutes when you're cooking for 40 tired, freezing people. But the first time I heard the knocking, I froze in place, my hands buried in a box of cod fillets. It was slow and deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, then 2 more. The sound didn't echo through the steel walls like normal noise would. It was muted, like it came from deep inside the meat racks. I told myself it was just the ship shifting, the hull groaning from the ice outside. But then it happened again, exactly the same rhythm, like it was waiting for me to notice. That's when I remembered Rule 10. If you hear knocking from inside the freezer, do not open it under any circumstances. I backed out of the freezer, locking the heavy door behind me. Still, the knocks continued, muffled through the metal. It went on for almost 5 minutes before stopping completely. I didn't tell anyone that night. Part of me hoped it had just been my imagination, a trick of fatigue, but the next shift, the knocking started again, the exact same pattern. And this time, it came when I wasn't even inside. I was in the galley, prepping vegetables, when I heard it faintly through the freezer wall. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to ignore it, but the human part, the curious, foolish part, wanted to know what could possibly make that sound. I almost opened the door, my hand gripping the latch, when I felt a sudden drop in temperature in the galley. The air turned biting cold, my breath visible in front of me. The knocking stopped instantly, replaced by the faint scrape of something moving along the inside wall, as though it were following my hand from the other side. The next morning, I found Kane at breakfast and told him what I'd heard. He didn't even look up from his tray. Good, you followed Rule 10. Don't make the mistake others have. I asked him what had happened before. His jaw tightened. They opened the door. I waited for more, but all he said was, "We had to seal the freezer for a week after that, and scrub the floor." Days passed, and I kept hearing the knocking. Sometimes it came at the same time every night. Other times it was random. Once it knocked the rhythm to shave and a haircut, and when I didn't answer, it slammed the inside wall so hard a pack of frozen beef fell to the floor. I stopped restocking the freezer alone after that. 2 nights ago, it escalated. I was prepping the midnight meal when I heard frantic pounding, not from the inside of the freezer, but from the outside. The sound was coming from the hall, near the other door that leads into the freezer from the storage side. I grabbed a knife, thinking maybe someone was trapped, but when I reached the door, the pounding stopped. I opened the hallway door to check, and the air on the other side was so cold it burned my lungs. The light flickered, and somewhere deep in the freezer, I heard the faintest whisper of my name. Last night, I found something new. A streak of frost ran from the freezer latch down to the floor, as if something inside had been breathing heavily against the door. The frost pattern wasn't random. It looked like the shape of a hand. 5 fingers splayed wide, pressed hard enough to leave an impression in the ice. Tonight the knocking hasn't started yet, but as I write this, I can hear faint breathing from behind the steel door. It's slow, patient, waiting, and I know that if I even think about opening it, I might not just find something inside. It might already be waiting for me, right on the other side of the latch. It was my 3rd week aboard the Aurora when I first heard the midnight bell. The sound didn't echo like a normal ship's bell. It rolled across the deck and through the walls like the ocean itself was carrying it. At first I thought it was just some nautical signal or a shift change call. But every crew member, no matter how busy they were, stopped immediately and started moving toward the mess hall. That's when I remembered Rule 11. When the captain rings the ship's bell at midnight, you must answer. No matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. I followed the others, feeling uneasy. The mess hall was quiet, except for the low hum of the heaters. Captain Harrow stood at the head of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning each of us as if counting. No one spoke. No one sat. After about 3 minutes of silence, he gave a single nod. All present, he said. And everyone slowly went back to their duties. No one explained what had just happened. The second time it happened, I was in the galley scrubbing pots. The bell rang once, twice, then a pause before a 3rd time. I wiped my hands and headed to the mess hall. This time I noticed something strange. The crew didn't look relieved after the head count. They looked afraid. I caught sight of Kane's pale face as he whispered something under his breath, too soft to hear. By the 4th time the bell rang at midnight, I was starting to dread it. The air seemed colder just before it happened, and the low groaning of the ice around the ship always quieted completely, as if the whole world was holding its breath. That night, a storm was raging outside, but when the bell rang, every sound vanished. The wind, the waves, even the creak of the hull. It was pure unnatural silence, until the 3rd chime faded. I asked Kane about it after. What happens if you don't answer the bell? His eyes darkened. You don't want to know, but I'll tell you this. It's not the captain you're answering to. When I pressed him, he shook his head. It listens, and it keeps count. The night I almost broke Rule 11 was the night I realized how dangerous it really was. I'd been in the freezer grabbing supplies when the 1st chime rang out. I was halfway out the door when I heard faint knocking from inside the freezer again. Slow, deliberate. I froze, torn between answering the bell and staying to deal with whatever was knocking. The 2nd chime sounded, and the knocking became frantic, like fists pounding from inside. My heart pounded as the 3rd chime rang. I slammed the freezer shut and ran to the mess hall, breathless. When I arrived, Captain Harrow's face was grim. "One missing," he said. My stomach twisted. It was Brooks, the junior engineer. The captain rang a small handheld bell 3 more times, each chime sharper than the last. We all waited, but Brooks never came. The next morning, his bunk was empty, his clothes neatly folded, but his boots were wet, sitting in a puddle of seawater. From then on, I never hesitated. No matter what I was doing, when that bell rang, I moved. Once it rang while I was using the bathroom. I didn't care. I bolted, joining the others as the captain counted. Another time, it rang while I was in my bunk, in nothing but a t-shirt. I ran barefoot down the hall. No one laughed. No one ever missed. Last night, though, something changed. The bell rang at midnight, as usual, but the sound was wrong. It was deeper, slower, and instead of 3 chimes, there were 4. The moment the 4th chime echoed, every crew member froze, eyes wide. Captain Harrow's expression turned to stone. "All present," he said, but his voice wavered. That was when I noticed the man standing at the far end of the mess hall. He was tall, too tall, his head almost brushing the ceiling. His skin was pale and damp, his eyes black as the ocean at night. No one else looked at him. No one acknowledged him. But as I stared, he smiled at me. A slow, unnatural stretch of the mouth, and I realized something awful. He had been knocking from inside the freezer all along. Tonight, it's almost midnight again. The bell hasn't rung yet, but I can hear footsteps pacing outside my cabin. Slow, heavy steps. They stop right at my door. I'm afraid that when the bell rings, I'll open the door to leave, and he'll be waiting for me. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.